The breaking point, when truth becomes secondary to confession. The screams echoed through the stone corridors of the Tower of London as Sir Francis Walsingham's interrogators worked methodically on their latest prisoner. The year was 1586, and another Catholic conspirator was about to confess to plotting against Queen Elizabeth V. What he would reveal under torture would seal not only his fate, but the fate of dozens of innocent men and women whose only crime was knowing his name. Throughout human history, the pursuit of justice has been corrupted by a fundamental flaw in our legal systems, the belief that confession equals truth. From ancient Rome to medieval Europe, from the Spanish Inquisition to modern-day interrogation rooms, authorities have employed increasingly sophisticated methods to extract admissions of guilt. But what happens when the methods themselves become more important than the truth they claim to seek? The Roman legal system, which forms the foundation of many modern judicial frameworks, operated on the principle that torture was not only acceptable, but necessary when questioning slaves and foreigners. The rack, the scourge, and red-hot iron were considered legitimate tools of investigation. Roman law explicitly stated that testimony obtained under duress from free citizens was inadmissible, yet the same protections did not extend to the lower classes. This created a two-tiered justice system where social status determined not only the outcome of trials, but the very methods used to obtain evidence. Medieval Europe expanded upon these Roman precedents with terrifying efficiency. The Catholic Church's Inquisition, established in 1184, developed what they called enhanced interrogation techniques, centuries before the term became a euphemism for modern torture. The inquisitors believed that saving souls justified any means necessary, including breaking bodies. Their manual, the Malleus Maleficarum, provided detailed instructions on how to extract confessions from suspected heretics and witches. The irony was that once torture began, confession became inevitable, not because the accused were guilty, but because human endurance has limits. The psychological manipulation employed alongside physical torture was equally devastating. Prisoners were shown the instruments that would be used on them, forced to watch others being tortured and subjected to sleep deprivation and sensory manipulation. The mere threat of torture proved so effective that many confessed before any physical pain was inflicted. This created a perverse incentive system where authorities learned that fear could be more powerful than actual violence. In today's world, we like to believe we've evolved beyond such barbaric practices, yet forced confessions remain alarmingly common. The Reed technique, developed in the 1950s and still widely used by American police, employs psychological pressure, isolation, and deception to obtain confessions. Suspects are kept in windowless rooms for hours, denied food and water, lied to about evidence, and manipulated through a carefully orchestrated process designed to break down their resistance. The technique has produced thousands of false confessions, leading to wrongful convictions that have destroyed innocent lives. The parallels between medieval torture chambers and modern interrogation rooms are more disturbing than we care to admit. While we no longer use thumbscrews and the rack, we've developed subtler but equally effective methods of coercion. Psychological torture leaves no visible scars, making it easier to deny and harder to prosecute. The end result remains the same. Innocent people confessing to crimes they didn't commit because the alternative, enduring continued torment, seems worse than accepting punishment for something they never did. What makes this history even more chilling is how little we've learned from it. Despite centuries of documented cases where torture produced false information, despite psychological research proving that extreme stress impairs memory and judgment, despite legal reforms supposedly protecting the innocent, forced confessions continue to destroy lives with frightening regularity. The methods have evolved, but the fundamental corruption of justice remains unchanged. The question we must confront is uncomfortable but essential. How many innocent souls have we condemned in our relentless pursuit of confession? And more importantly, how many more will we sacrifice before we finally learn that truth cannot be tortured into existence? Ready to dive deeper into humanity's darkest chapter, the rabbit hole goes much deeper than you think. Like this video if you're brave enough to continue this journey, and comment below, what's the most disturbing historical justice practice you've ever heard of? Don't forget to subscribe, because someone needs to tell these untold stories, and it might as well be us. The Roman foundation of forced confessions, when law made lying under pressure legal. The screams of Gaius Gracchus echoed through the Forum Romanum as Senator Lucius Opimius watched his interrogators extract yet another confession about the grain conspiracy of 121 BC. What Gaius would admit under the lash, that he had conspired with foreign enemies to overthrow the Republic, was completely fabricated, but it would provide the legal justification Opimius needed to execute hundreds of Roman citizens. The confession was false, the conspiracy was invented, and the innocent would die. But according to Roman law, Gaius's forced admission made it all perfectly legal. Roman law didn't just permit torture. It created the world's first systematic framework for manufacturing confessions that could be used to condemn the innocent while maintaining the appearance of justice. The principle of quaestio per tormenta established that certain classes of people could only provide valid testimony under torture, creating a legal system where forced confessions weren't just accepted, but required for prosecution in many cases. The Roman distinction between citizens and non-citizens created a two-tiered confession system that would echo through history. While free Roman citizens initially enjoyed protection from torture, this protection evaporated whenever they were accused of crimes against the state. The crime of maiestas, treason, was so broadly defined that almost any political opposition could be classified as betrayal, instantly stripping accused citizens of their rights and subjecting them to confession extraction through systematic brutality. What made Roman forced confessions particularly dangerous was their bureaucratic precision. The Digest of Justinian codified exactly which torture methods could be used on different classes of people, how many lashes could be administered, and what medical care must be provided to keep victims alive long enough to provide detailed confessions. This wasn't random violence, it was a legal assembly line for manufacturing admissions of guilt that could be used to justify predetermined punishments. The case of the Catiline conspiracy in 63 BC demonstrates how Roman confession extraction worked in practice. Senators arrested on suspicion of plotting against the state were subjected to graduated torture until they provided detailed admissions of their treasonous activities. These confessions were then used to justify their immediate execution without trial, all perfectly legal according to Roman procedures. The fact that many of the conspirators were likely innocent was irrelevant. Their forced confessions provided the legal cover needed for political elimination. Roman interrogators perfected the art of confession cross-contamination, where details extracted from one victim were used to pressure confessions from others. Slaves arrested in connection with the same crime were tortured separately until they provided matching accounts of their master's guilt, creating seemingly independent corroboration for accusations that were entirely manufactured. This technique produced elaborate conspiracy narratives that could implicate dozens of innocent people based on nothing more than coordinated confession extraction. The psychological sophistication of Roman confession techniques prefigured modern methods in disturbing ways. Roman law recognized that the threat of torture was often more effective than its application. leading to procedures where victims were shown instruments, forced to watch others being tortured, and given detailed descriptions of what would happen to them unless they confessed. Many Roman prisoners confessed immediately upon arrest, never experiencing physical torture but still providing the forced admissions needed to justify their punishment. Modern legal systems have inherited Rome's fundamental assumption that confession equals guilt, regardless of how that confession was obtained. The Reed technique, used by American police, employs psychological pressure that Roman interrogators would recognize immediately. Isolation, false evidence presentation, exhaustion, and graduated threats designed to make confession seem like the only rational option. The techniques have evolved, but the underlying logic remains Roman. Break resistance, extract admission, justify punishment. The parallels between Roman confession procedures and contemporary plea bargaining systems are particularly striking. Just as Roman authorities offered reduced punishment in exchange for confession and cooperation in implicating others, modern prosecutors routinely pressure defendants to confess to crimes they didn't commit by threatening harsh sentences unless they accept plea deals. The result is identical: innocent people confessing to avoid worse consequences, providing legal justification for their punishment while maintaining the system's appearance of justice. Roman confession extraction created precedents that continue to corrupt justice systems worldwide. The principle that certain classes of people are inherently less credible and thus require coercive interrogation has evolved into modern practices that disproportionately target minorities, the poor, and the mentally ill. The Roman assumption that resistance to interrogation indicates guilt has become embedded in police training that teaches officers to interpret denial as evidence of deception, requiring increased pressure. Perhaps most disturbing is how Roman legal scholars created intellectual frameworks for justifying forced confessions that persist in modern jurisprudence. The argument that extreme measures are necessary to protect society from existential threats, that confession validates investigative methods regardless of their brutality, and that the greater good justifies individual suffering, all trace directly back to Roman legal theory. Modern enhanced interrogation programs employ the same moral reasoning that Roman jurists used to justify torturing confessions from political prisoners. The Roman legacy in forced confessions extends beyond technique to encompass the entire mindset that views confession as the ultimate goal of investigation rather than truth-seeking. Roman authorities weren't interested in determining what actually happened. They wanted admissions that would provide legal justification for predetermined outcomes. This approach transformed law enforcement from an investigative process into a confession manufacturing operation, creating systems that prioritize efficiency over accuracy and legal cover over justice. The case studies that survive from Roman times reveal patterns that repeat throughout history: innocent people confessing to crimes they didn't commit, false conspiracies created through coordinated confession extraction, and entire populations terrorized by the knowledge that anyone could be forced to confess to anything if authorities decided they posed a threat. These patterns didn't disappear with the fall of Rome. They became embedded in legal traditions that continue to operate in modified forms across the modern world. The Roman foundation of forced confessions established templates that have proven remarkably resistant to reform because they serve the interests of authority while providing plausible legal justification for their abuse. Every modern interrogation room, every plea bargain negotiation, every enhanced interrogation protocol operates according to principles first codified in Roman law. Apply pressure, extract confession, justify outcome, maintain system legitimacy. Think the Romans were just ancient history? Think again. Their legal innovations are alive and well in courtrooms today. Smash that like button if this connection between ancient and modern injustice shocked you, and drop a comment. Which modern interrogation practice do you think Romans would recognize? Subscribe now, because understanding our past is the only way to avoid repeating these mistakes. The Inquisition's perfection, when faith became a weapon of terror. The screams coming from beneath the Cathedral of Toledo had been echoing for 3 days when Isabella Martinez finally broke. It was 1485, and the Spanish Inquisition had perfected what they called La Cuestión, the question. But Isabella's torturers weren't asking about her alleged Jewish practices. They wanted names, lots of names, and they would get them, along with detailed confessions about a vast conspiracy that existed only in the minds of her interrogators and in the words they forced from her broken lips. The Inquisition represents perhaps history's most systematic approach to forced confession, transforming torture from a crude legal tool into a refined science of psychological and physical destruction. What made the Inquisition particularly terrifying wasn't just its brutality, but its efficiency, its bureaucracy, and its absolute conviction that it served God's will. Every confession extracted, every innocent condemned, every family destroyed was carefully documented and filed away as evidence of divine justice in action. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, inherited techniques from its medieval predecessors, but refined them with terrifying precision. The inquisitors understood that fear was more powerful than pain, that anticipation was worse than experience, and that isolation could break minds more effectively than any physical torture. Their manual, the Directorium Inquisitorum, reads like a psychological warfare textbook, providing detailed instructions on how to manipulate human vulnerability to extract desired confessions. The process began with denunciation, often anonymous accusations that could destroy lives without evidence. Once arrested, victims entered a system designed to guarantee confession, regardless of guilt. They were held in solitary confinement, denied contact with family or legal counsel, and subjected to a carefully orchestrated psychological assault. Inquisitors would claim to have overwhelming evidence of guilt while offering confession as the only path to salvation, both spiritual and physical. The physical torture methods employed by the Inquisition were horrifyingly sophisticated. The garrucha involved hoisting victims by their arms tied behind their backs, often with weights attached to their feet. The toca simulated drowning by forcing water down the victim's throat through cloth. The potro stretched victims on a rack while their limbs were systematically dislocated. But perhaps most insidious was how these techniques were calibrated to cause maximum psychological impact while keeping victims alive and capable of providing detailed confessions. What makes the Inquisition's methods particularly relevant to modern times is their emphasis on psychological manipulation over purely physical torture. Inquisitors discovered that threatening family members was more effective than threatening the accused. They learned that sensory deprivation, sleep interruption, and temperature manipulation could break resistance without leaving obvious marks. They pioneered the use of false evidence, planted witnesses, and fabricated documentation to convince victims that resistance was futile. The parallels to modern interrogation techniques are impossible to ignore. The CIA's Enhanced Interrogation Program, detailed in the Senate Torture Report, employed methods that would have been instantly recognizable to Spanish inquisitors. Waterboarding is essentially an updated version of the toca. Prolonged stress positions mirror the garrucha's effects. Sexual humiliation, temperature manipulation, and sleep deprivation were standard Inquisition practices that found new life in 21st-century detention facilities. Consider the case of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was waterboarded 183 times at CIA black sites. Like Inquisition victims, he eventually confessed to everything his interrogators wanted to hear, not because the confessions were true, but because the alternative was continued torture. His detailed admissions of responsibility for numerous terrorist plots served the same function as Isabella Martinez's confessions about Jewish conspiracies. They provided authorities with the narrative they needed, while having little relationship to actual facts. The Inquisition's bureaucratic approach to torture also presaged modern practices. Every session was carefully documented, with scribes recording confessions word for word. Medical personnel monitored victims to ensure they remained capable of providing information. Legal advisors ensured that proper procedures were followed, creating a veneer of legitimacy around systematic brutality. These practices find their modern equivalent in the detailed documentation of interrogation sessions, the presence of medical personnel at torture sites, and the legal memos justifying enhanced interrogation. Perhaps most disturbing is how the Inquisition created a culture where torture was not only accepted, but celebrated as a tool of righteousness. Public confessions and executions became entertainment, with crowds gathering to witness justice being served. The victims themselves were often convinced they deserved their fate, having been psychologically broken to the point where they genuinely believed their forced confessions reflected reality. This psychological destruction was considered a feature, not a bug, evidence that the process was working as intended. The legacy of the Inquisition extends far beyond its historical period. Its techniques influenced legal systems across Europe and the Americas, creating precedents that persist today. The presumption that extreme measures are justified when fighting existential threats, the belief that confession validates investigative methods, and the acceptance of psychological torture as distinct from real torture all trace back to innovations pioneered by Spanish inquisitors. The Inquisition proved that ordinary people could be transformed into torturers when convinced they were serving a higher purpose. This lesson has been repeatedly demonstrated in modern contexts, from Soviet show trials to American detention facilities, wherever authorities convince themselves that their cause justifies any means necessary to achieve desired confessions. Still think the Inquisition was just about religious extremism. These holy torture techniques are still being used today, just with different justifications. Hit that like button if you're starting to see the terrifying patterns, and tell us in the comments what modern security measure reminds you most of Inquisition tactics. Subscribe and ring that notification bell, because someone needs to connect these dots, and mainstream history classes sure won't. Witch hunts and mass confessions. When hysteria became legal procedure, the confession of Bridget Bishop would seal her fate on June 10, 1692, when she became the first victim executed during the Salem witch trials. But Bridget never confessed to witchcraft, and that's exactly why she died. In the twisted logic of Salem, confession meant salvation, and denial meant death. Those who admitted to consorting with the devil were spared to name others, while those who maintained their innocence were condemned as unrepentant servants of evil. It was a system designed to generate confessions, spread terror, and destroy communities through manufactured guilt. The witch trials represent perhaps history's most devastating example of how forced confessions can create entirely fictional realities that entire societies accept as truth. From Salem to Würzburg, from Scotland to the German principalities, witch hunters perfected techniques for extracting detailed admissions of impossible crimes, creating elaborate mythologies of diabolic conspiracy that existed nowhere except in the testimonies they tortured from their victims. The process typically began with spectral evidence. Dreams, visions, or unexplained misfortunes blamed on supernatural malice. But witch hunters needed more than accusations. They needed confessions that would validate their worldview and justify their methods. The techniques they employed combined physical torture with psychological manipulation, creating a system where confession became the only rational choice, regardless of guilt or innocence. In the German principalities, Prince Bishop Julius Ector of Würzburg presided over trials that killed over 1,200 people between 1626 and 1631. His interrogators used the strappado, a pulley system that dislocated shoulders while victims hung by their wrists. They employed thumb screws that slowly crushed finger bones and leg vices that could shatter shin bones with gradual pressure. But the physical torture was only part of their arsenal. They also perfected techniques of sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, and psychological terror that proved equally effective at generating confessions. The witch trials revealed how mass hysteria could be weaponized through forced confessions. Each person tortured into admitting witchcraft was compelled to name accomplices, creating ever-expanding circles of accusation and confession. The confessions themselves became evidence for the reality of witchcraft, creating a closed loop where torture-induced admissions validated the very system that produced them. Communities tore themselves apart as neighbors accused neighbors, families turned against each other, and social bonds dissolved under the pressure of organized paranoia. What made witch trial confessions particularly insidious was their detailed specificity. Torture victims didn't just admit to being witches, they provided elaborate accounts of Sabbaths attended, pacts signed with Satan, and specific acts of maleficium performed against their neighbors. These details, extracted under extreme duress, created compelling narratives that convinced even skeptical observers of their validity. The confessions were so detailed and consistent that they seemed to provide independent corroboration of each other, when in reality they reflected the standardized interrogation techniques used to produce them. The parallels to modern mass confession phenomena are striking and disturbing. The daycare abuse panic of the 1980s and 1990s, which destroyed hundreds of lives based on fabricated confessions, employed techniques that would have been familiar to witch trial investigators. Children were subjected to leading questions, isolated from parents, and pressured through suggestion and intimidation until they confessed to experiencing abuse that never occurred. The McMartin preschool case, the longest and most expensive criminal trial in American history, was built entirely on forced confessions from children who were manipulated into describing elaborate ritual abuse scenarios. Soviet show trials of the 1930s represented another evolution of witch trial methodology. Stalin's NKVD perfected techniques for extracting detailed confessions of treason and conspiracy from loyal party members, creating elaborate narratives of plots that existed only in the imaginations of their interrogators. Like witch trial victims, Soviet prisoners learned that confession led to quicker death, while denial meant prolonged torture, creating powerful incentives to admit to crimes they never committed while implicating others in fictional conspiracies. The psychological techniques pioneered during witch trials continue to influence modern interrogation methods. The Reed technique's emphasis on confrontation, isolation, and psychological pressure mirrors the approach used by witch hunters to break down resistance and extract admissions. False evidence presentation, a standard component of modern police interrogation, was perfected by witch trial investigators who claimed to have overwhelming proof of supernatural crimes. The presumption of guilt that underlies coercive interrogation can be traced directly back to witch trial procedures, where denial was interpreted as evidence of guilt. Perhaps most disturbing is how witch trials demonstrated the human capacity for creating false memories under extreme stress. Torture victims often came to believe their forced confessions reflected real experiences, developing detailed memories of events that never occurred. This phenomenon, now understood through psychological research on memory formation under trauma, explains how innocent people can confess to crimes they didn't commit, while genuinely believing their admissions are truthful. The witch trials also revealed how confession-based justice systems create perverse incentives that prioritize admission over truth. Authorities learned that torture produced the confessions they needed to validate their worldview, creating institutional momentum toward increasing brutality and expanding accusations. The system became self-perpetuating, with each confession justifying further investigations and more torture, until entire regions descended into paranoid chaos. Modern examples of confession-driven hysteria continue to emerge with depressing regularity. The satanic ritual abuse panic, the recovered memory movement, and various conspiracy-driven prosecutions all demonstrate how the techniques perfected during witch trials continue to destroy innocent lives. The underlying psychology remains unchanged. Extreme pressure produces confessions. Confessions are interpreted as truth, and truth becomes whatever authorities need it to be to justify their actions. The witch trials' ultimate legacy lies in their demonstration that entire societies can be mobilized to torture confessions from innocent people while convincing themselves they're protecting their communities from existential threats. This lesson has never been more relevant than in our current era of moral panics, conspiracy theories, and security-driven hysteria. Think witch trials were just medieval superstition? These confession extraction techniques never went away. They just found new targets and new justifications. Smash that like button if you're seeing the connections, and drop a comment. Which modern mass hysteria reminds you most of Salem? Don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started exposing how these dark patterns keep repeating throughout history. Eastern confession extraction. When ancient philosophy became tools for false admissions, the bamboo grew slowly through Li Wei's abdomen as the Ming dynasty magistrate waited patiently for his confession. It was 1580, and Li had been positioned over the carefully planted shoots 3 days earlier, accused of embezzling from the imperial granary. As the bamboo pierced his flesh millimeter by millimeter, Li provided increasingly detailed admissions of crimes he had never committed, implicating dozens of innocent colleagues in a corruption network that existed only in the confessions extracted through this exquisite torture. By the time the bamboo reached his vital organs, Li had confessed to stealing enough grain to feed a small army, naming names and providing documentation for a conspiracy that would justify the execution of half the provincial bureaucracy. Eastern civilizations perfected the art of extracting false confessions through techniques that combined philosophical insights about human consciousness with methodical brutality designed to break mental resistance. While Western torture often relied on crude physical violence, Eastern methods demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate the mind itself, creating false admissions that were often more detailed and convincing than any truth could provide. Chinese confession extraction, codified during the Tang dynasty, operated on the principle that resistance to authority indicated moral corruption requiring correction through suffering. The Tanglu legal code specified that confessions were essential for conviction in most criminal cases, creating systematic pressure for authorities to extract admissions regardless of actual guilt. This legal requirement transformed interrogation from an investigative tool into a confession manufacturing process, where the goal was not discovering truth, but producing admissions that would satisfy legal requirements. The Chinese perfected what they called water confession techniques that were far more sophisticated than crude Western waterboarding. Victims were positioned so that water slowly filled their nasal cavities while maintaining their ability to speak clearly, creating repeated drowning sensations that could be sustained for hours without causing death. Between each episode, victims were required to provide detailed confessions, with the water treatment resuming until their admissions satisfied their interrogators. This technique was so effective that most victims confessed to elaborate crimes rather than endure repeated simulated drowning. The psychological sophistication of Chinese confession extraction centered on the concept of face and social harmony. Victims were told that their resistance to confession was causing suffering for their families, dishonoring their ancestors, and disrupting social order. This cultural manipulation proved more effective than physical torture for many victims, who provided detailed false confessions to protect their loved ones and restore their perceived social standing. The resulting admissions appeared voluntary and were often accompanied by expressions of gratitude toward the authorities who had helped them acknowledge their crimes. Japanese confession techniques during the Tokugawa period, 1603–1868, incorporated Zen principles of mental discipline into interrogation methods designed to break psychological resistance. The Seiza torture involved maintaining painful kneeling positions for extended periods while being subjected to repetitive questioning designed to induce altered states of consciousness. Victims often reported experiencing dissociative episodes during which they confessed to crimes they couldn't remember committing, providing authorities with admissions that appeared authentic because the victims themselves believed them to be true. The concept of death by 1,000 cuts was preceded by confession by 1,000 questions, where victims were subjected to endless repetitive interrogation designed to break down their mental defenses through exhaustion and confusion. Each question was carefully crafted to elicit specific admissions, with victims gradually led through predetermined confession narratives that implicated them in increasingly serious crimes. The technique was so refined that victims often completed their confessions before their interrogators finished asking questions, anticipating what admissions were expected and providing them to end their psychological torment. Korean confession extraction during the Joseon dynasty incorporated Confucian concepts of moral correction through suffering, creating systems where false confession was presented as a form of spiritual purification. Victims were told that admitting to crimes they hadn't committed demonstrated proper understanding of their inherent sinfulness and willingness to accept responsibility for disrupting social harmony. This philosophical framework made false confession seem like moral behavior rather than self-destructive testimony, encouraging detailed admissions that were celebrated as evidence of the confessor's spiritual growth. Modern parallels to Eastern confession techniques are found in the thought reform programs developed by communist governments throughout Asia. Chinese re-education camps, North Korean political prisons, and Vietnamese correction facilities all employ confession extraction methods that trace directly back to imperial-era techniques. Victims are subjected to extended isolation, repetitive questioning, and psychological pressure designed to break down their sense of reality until they provide detailed admissions of ideological crimes they never committed. The Korean War demonstrated how Eastern confession techniques could be applied to Western prisoners with devastating effectiveness. American POWs subjected to Chinese and North Korean interrogation methods often provided detailed confessions of war crimes, biological warfare, and imperialist conspiracies that shocked the American public when broadcast as propaganda. These confessions were extracted through techniques that combined traditional Eastern psychological manipulation with communist ideological pressure, creating admissions that appeared voluntary while being entirely coerced. Contemporary Chinese interrogation of dissidents continues to employ traditional confession extraction methods, updated with modern technology. Falun Gong practitioners, democracy activists, and ethnic minorities report being subjected to extended interrogation sessions designed to extract confessions of anti-state activities. The techniques combine traditional Chinese psychological pressure with modern surveillance technology, creating comprehensive confession extraction systems that operate with industrial efficiency while maintaining traditional cultural justifications for their implementation. The influence of Eastern confession techniques on Western interrogation methods can be seen in the adoption of prolonged stress positions, sleep deprivation, and psychological manipulation as standard practices in military and intelligence contexts. The scientific study of Eastern torture methods by Western researchers led to the development of enhanced interrogation techniques that incorporated traditional Asian psychological manipulation into modern confession extraction protocols. Perhaps most disturbing is how Eastern confession techniques demonstrated that sophisticated philosophical and cultural frameworks could be used to make false confessions seem morally necessary rather than legally coerced. By embedding confession extraction into broader narratives about social harmony, spiritual correction, and moral development, Eastern systems created environments where victims felt obligated to confess to crimes they hadn't committed as demonstrations of their cultural and spiritual understanding. The Eastern approach to false confession extraction revealed how cultural sophistication and philosophical depth provide no protection against the systematic manufacture of false admissions. Indeed, the combination of advanced understanding of human psychology with cultural authorization for confession extraction consistently produced some of history's most effective techniques for destroying innocent lives while maintaining the appearance of voluntary cooperation and moral correction. Think Eastern philosophy was all about peace and enlightenment. These ancient masters turned human psychology into a weapon that modern interrogators still study and copy. Hit that like button if this shattered your assumptions about Eastern wisdom, and comment below, which modern psychological pressure technique do you think has the deepest historical roots? Subscribe now, because understanding how ancient cruelty shaped modern methods is crucial to recognizing it when it happens today. The industrial manufacturing of false confessions, when technology made lying under pressure more efficient. The telegraph wires hummed with urgent messages as Detective Thomas Burns coordinated the largest confession extraction operation in New York City's history. It was 1886, and the Haymarket bombing had created public pressure for arrests and confessions that would demonstrate police effectiveness in combating anarchist terrorism. Using the latest innovations in criminal identification, communication technology, and systematic interrogation, Burns would extract detailed confessions from 8 innocent men, creating a conspiracy narrative that satisfied public demand for justice while bearing no relationship to actual events. The confessions were documented with photographic precision, transmitted instantly across telegraph networks, and presented as scientific evidence of guilt, representing the dawn of industrial-scale false confession manufacturing. The Industrial Revolution transformed confession extraction from a medieval craft practiced by individual torturers into a mass production process that could generate false admissions with factory-like efficiency. Steam power, precision engineering, and scientific methodology were all applied to the systematic manufacture of confessions, creating techniques that could break human resistance more reliably while producing better documentation of the resulting false admissions. The development of photography revolutionized confession documentation, creating permanent records that appeared to provide objective evidence of guilt. Prisoners were photographed before and after interrogation, with the visual evidence of their psychological breakdown used to support the validity of their confessions. The Bertillon identification system, developed in 1882, created detailed physical profiles of confession victims that allowed authorities to track their responses to different interrogation techniques, turning confession extraction into an empirical science with measurable outcomes and refinable methodologies. Telegraph networks enabled the coordination of confession-based investigations across vast distances, allowing authorities to extract matching admissions from suspects in different cities simultaneously. The ability to transmit confession details instantly meant that interrogators could share specific information between locations, creating the appearance of independent corroboration when victims in separate facilities provided identical false admissions. This technological networking effect amplified the impact of individual false confessions, turning isolated cases of manufactured guilt into comprehensive conspiracy narratives that could implicate dozens of innocent people. The mass production of confession extraction equipment democratized sophisticated interrogation techniques, making advanced psychological manipulation tools available to local police departments that had previously relied on crude physical violence. Catalog companies began advertising interview room furniture, suspect restraint systems, and psychological pressure devices alongside industrial machinery, treating the systematic manufacture of confessions as just another technical challenge requiring proper equipment and methodology. Electric lighting transformed the temporal dynamics of interrogation, enabling extended questioning sessions that could continue around the clock without natural breaks imposed by darkness. Prisoners could be kept under constant illumination while being subjected to continuous interrogation, creating disorientation and sleep deprivation that made them more susceptible to providing false confessions. The ability to control lighting conditions precisely allowed interrogators to manipulate suspects' circadian rhythms and psychological state with unprecedented precision. The development of stenography and mechanical recording devices created permanent documentation of confession extraction sessions, producing transcripts that appeared to provide objective evidence of voluntary admissions while obscuring the coercive techniques used to obtain them. These records were designed to capture suspects' words while minimizing documentation of interrogation methods, creating legal evidence that supported false confessions while providing deniability about the techniques used to manufacture them. Industrial management principles were applied to confession extraction, creating systematic approaches that divided the interrogation process into specialized tasks performed by different personnel. Interrogation teams included specialists in psychological pressure, evidence presentation, physical intimidation, and documentation, allowing each participant to focus on their specific role while diffusing individual responsibility for the overall abuse. This assembly line approach to manufacturing false confessions increased efficiency while making it easier for participants to avoid confronting the moral implications of their collective actions. The rise of scientific criminology provided intellectual justification for systematic confession extraction, with researchers like Cesare Lombroso claiming that criminal behavior could be identified through physical characteristics, and that confession was necessary to confirm scientific determinations of guilt. This pseudo-scientific framework transformed confession extraction from a morally questionable practice into a technically justified procedure that appeared to be based on objective methodology rather than subjective brutality. Modern police interrogation facilities are direct descendants of industrial-era confession manufacturing systems, incorporating technological advances in surveillance, environmental control, and psychological manipulation. Two-way mirrors, hidden recording devices, climate control systems, and acoustic isolation all serve the same function as their 19th century predecessors, creating controlled environments where psychological pressure can be applied systematically to extract false confessions while maintaining legal documentation of apparently voluntary admissions. The bureaucratization of confession extraction, accelerated by industrial management techniques, created systems where individual responsibility for false confessions could be diffused across multiple participants and organizational levels. Just as factory production lines allowed workers to avoid responsibility for defective products by claiming they were only performing their assigned tasks, confession extraction systems developed specialized roles that enabled participants to deny personal accountability for the innocent lives destroyed by their collective efforts. Computer databases have taken the industrial approach to false confession manufacturing to its logical conclusion, enabling the storage and analysis of vast quantities of interrogation data to identify which techniques are most effective against specific demographic groups. Modern law enforcement agencies can access detailed profiles of suspects' psychological vulnerabilities, criminal histories, and social connections before interrogation begins, allowing them to customize their confession extraction strategies with unprecedented precision. The quality control systems developed for industrial production have been adapted to confession extraction, with supervisors monitoring interrogation sessions to ensure that proper psychological pressure techniques are being applied and that resulting confessions meet legal standards for admissibility. These oversight systems are designed to maximize the efficiency of false confession production while minimizing the legal risks associated with obvious coercion, creating bureaucratic accountability for manufacturing false admissions while maintaining plausible deniability about their authenticity. Perhaps most disturbing is how industrial efficiency made false confession extraction more palatable to democratic societies by sanitizing its appearance and systematizing its implementation. When confession manufacturing became clean, scientific, and bureaucratically managed, it lost much of its visceral horror for observers who didn't directly witness its application. This sanitization of systematic deception enabled the expansion of false confession practices even as societies ostensibly became more civilized and humanitarian. The legacy of industrialized false confession manufacturing lives on in every interrogation room, equipped with modern technology. Every systematic approach to breaking human resistance through controlled psychological pressure, and every bureaucratic system that treats the destruction of innocent lives as an acceptable cost of maintaining apparent law enforcement effectiveness. Think technology always makes the world more humane? The Industrial Revolution turned torture into a science, and we're still living with the consequences. Smash that like button if you're starting to see how progress can be a double-edged sword, and tell us in the comments, what modern, non-lethal police technology do you think has the darkest historical precedent? Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because understanding how technology amplifies human cruelty is essential in our digital age. Psychological warfare. The mind as the ultimate battlefield. Dr. Ewan Cameron smiled as he reviewed the progress reports from his patients at the Allen Memorial Institute. It was 1957, and his CIA-funded MK-Ultra experiments were yielding fascinating results. Through a combination of LSD administration, prolonged sensory deprivation, and repetitive audio loops, he had successfully erased the personalities of dozens of psychiatric patients, leaving them in childlike states where they could be reprogrammed with new identities. What Cameron didn't record in his clinical notes was how many of these patients confessed to crimes they had never committed during their periods of chemically induced vulnerability, or how their forced admissions were being used to test the limits of psychological manipulation. The 20th century witnessed the emergence of psychological torture as the dominant method of extracting confessions, representing a fundamental shift from physical brutality to mental manipulation. This evolution wasn't driven by humanitarian concerns, but by practical considerations. Psychological torture leaves no visible marks, is harder to document, and often proves more effective at breaking resistance than traditional physical methods. The result has been the development of techniques that can destroy human minds while maintaining plausible deniability about their implementation. The Soviet Union pioneered many modern psychological torture techniques through their extensive experience with political prisoners and show trials. The NKVD discovered that isolation, sleep deprivation, and sensory manipulation could break even the strongest-willed individuals without resorting to crude physical violence. Their techniques were refined through decades of practice on millions of victims, creating a comprehensive understanding of how to manipulate human psychology to extract desired confessions, regardless of their relationship to truth. Stalin's show trials of the 1930s demonstrated the effectiveness of psychological manipulation on a massive scale. High-ranking Communist Party officials, military leaders, and intellectuals were broken down through months of isolation, interrogation, and psychological pressure until they eagerly confessed to elaborate conspiracies against the state. These confessions were so detailed and seemingly authentic that they convinced millions of observers worldwide that the trials represented genuine justice rather than sophisticated psychological warfare. The techniques employed by Soviet interrogators became the foundation for modern psychological torture. Prisoners were kept in tiny cells with constant lighting, preventing normal sleep cycles and inducing disorientation. They were subjected to temperature extremes, denied adequate food and water, and isolated from all human contact except their interrogators. The combination of physical discomfort and psychological pressure created altered states of consciousness, where victims became highly suggestible and eager to confess to anything that might end their suffering. Perhaps most insidiously, Soviet interrogators perfected the art of making victims complicit in their own destruction. Through carefully applied psychological pressure, prisoners were convinced that confession was not only inevitable, but morally necessary. They were shown fabricated evidence of their friends' betrayals, told that their families would suffer unless they cooperated, and gradually manipulated into believing that their resistance was selfish and harmful to others. This technique produced confessions that appeared voluntary and heartfelt, making them far more convincing than admissions extracted through obvious coercion. The Chinese Communist Party refined Soviet techniques through their extensive thought reform programs of the 1950s and beyond. Chinese interrogators understood that breaking individual resistance was less important than reconstructing entire belief systems, leading to techniques that focused on identity destruction and rebuilding rather than simple confession extraction. Prisoners were subjected to months or years of re-education that combined isolation, group pressure, self-criticism sessions, and ideological indoctrination until they genuinely believed the crimes they were forced to confess. American intelligence agencies, initially shocked by the effectiveness of communist psychological techniques against captured personnel during the Korean War, launched extensive research programs to understand and replicate these methods. The CIA's MK-Ultra program, running from 1953 to 1973, involved hundreds of experiments on unwitting subjects designed to develop techniques for psychological manipulation and control. These experiments included LSD administration, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, and various forms of psychological abuse, all aimed at finding methods to break resistance and extract information. The development of the Reed technique in the 1950s brought sophisticated psychological manipulation into routine American police work. Created by John Reed and Fred Inbau, this interrogation method employs systematic psychological pressure designed to break down suspects' resistance through isolation, confrontation, and emotional manipulation. The technique assumes guilt from the outset and uses psychological warfare principles to convince suspects that confession is their only rational option, regardless of their actual culpability. Modern psychological torture techniques have been refined through decades of research into human psychology, neuroscience, and behavior modification. Sleep deprivation, now understood to impair judgment and increase suggestibility, has become a standard component of enhanced interrogation. Sensory manipulation, including exposure to loud music, bright lights, and temperature extremes, is used to create disorientation and psychological dependency on interrogators. Sexual humiliation, exploitation of phobias, and threats against family members are employed to break down psychological defenses. The psychological approach to torture has proven particularly effective because it exploits fundamental aspects of human nature. Humans are social creatures who suffer intensely from isolation and rejection. We are meaning-making beings who struggle to maintain psychological coherence when subjected to contradictory information and impossible choices. We have powerful drives for self-preservation that can be manipulated through carefully applied threats and promises. Psychological torturers exploit all of these vulnerabilities to create situations where confession becomes the only psychologically tolerable option. Perhaps most disturbing is how psychological torture creates false memories and genuine belief in fabricated confessions. Under extreme psychological pressure, the human mind often constructs explanatory narratives that make sense of the suffering being experienced. Victims begin to believe they must be guilty of something to deserve their treatment, leading them to confess to crimes they didn't commit while genuinely believing their admissions are truthful. This phenomenon explains how innocent people can provide detailed, emotionally convincing confessions that persuade even skeptical observers. The techniques of psychological warfare have found their way into civilian interrogation contexts with devastating results. Police departments across America routinely employ isolation, deception, psychological pressure, and emotional manipulation to extract confessions from suspects, often producing false admissions that lead to wrongful convictions. The Central Park Five, the Norfolk Four, and hundreds of other documented cases demonstrate how psychological torture techniques developed for military and intelligence purposes have corrupted civilian justice systems. Modern technology has amplified the effectiveness of psychological torture while making it easier to conceal. Surveillance systems allow authorities to monitor every aspect of prisoners' lives, creating paranoia and psychological pressure even when direct interrogation isn't occurring. Social media analysis provides detailed psychological profiles that can be used to customize interrogation approaches for maximum effectiveness. Artificial intelligence systems are being developed to predict which psychological pressure points will be most effective against specific personality types. The ultimate goal of psychological torture isn't just confession extraction, but complete psychological domination. By breaking down victims' sense of reality, identity, and moral framework, psychological torturers create individuals who are not just willing to confess, but eager to please their captors in any way possible. This level of psychological control represents a form of mental murder that can be more devastating than physical torture, destroying the essence of who people are while leaving their bodies technically intact. The proliferation of psychological torture techniques represents one of the most dangerous developments in the history of confession extraction. Unlike physical torture, which is limited by the need to keep victims alive and functional, psychological torture can continue indefinitely, gradually destroying minds while maintaining plausible deniability about its implementation. The victims often appear to be cooperating voluntarily, making it difficult for observers to recognize the coercion being applied. Starting to understand why enhanced interrogation is just a euphemism. Psychological torture doesn't leave bruises, but it destroys minds just as effectively as any medieval rack. Hit that like button if you're realizing how sophisticated modern torture has become, and drop a comment. What psychological pressure technique do you think is most commonly used but least recognized? Subscribe now, because recognizing psychological manipulation is the first step to protecting yourself and others from it. Modern techniques and false confessions, the sanitized brutality of contemporary justice. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Detective Sarah Chen adjusted the temperature in interview room 3 for the 4th time in 2 hours. It was 2019, and she was employing the latest refinements of the Reed technique on Marcus Williams, a developmentally disabled teenager suspected of armed robbery. The room was windowless, the chairs uncomfortable, and Marcus had been denied food, water, and contact with family for 6 hours. By the time Chen finished her interview, Marcus would confess to 3 robberies he didn't commit, providing detailed descriptions of crimes that occurred while he was documentably elsewhere. His confession would be videotaped, legally admissible, and completely false. A perfect example of how modern interrogation techniques produce the appearance of justice while destroying innocent lives. Contemporary forced confession techniques represent the culmination of centuries of refinement in psychological manipulation, wrapped in legal procedures that provide cover for systematic abuse. While modern democratic societies officially prohibit torture, they have developed interrogation methods that achieve the same results through psychological pressure, deception, and environmental manipulation. These techniques are more effective than historical torture methods precisely because they appear humane and voluntary to outside observers. The Reed technique, developed in the 1950s and still widely used by American police, employs a systematic 9-step process designed to break down suspects' resistance through psychological warfare. The technique begins with direct confrontation, where interrogators assert the suspect's guilt with absolute certainty, regardless of the evidence. Suspects are then presented with fabricated evidence, false witness statements, and manufactured proof of their culpability, creating a psychological environment where denial seems futile and confession appears to be the only rational option. The physical environment of modern interrogation rooms is carefully designed to maximize psychological pressure while maintaining legal acceptability. Rooms are typically small, windowless, and acoustically isolated, creating a sense of confinement and separation from the outside world. Temperature, lighting, and seating are manipulated to create discomfort without obvious abuse. Two-way mirrors and hidden cameras allow for observation and recording while creating paranoia about unseen watchers. These environmental factors combine to create psychological stress that makes suspects more susceptible to interrogation techniques. Sleep deprivation has become a standard component of modern interrogation, often achieved through extended questioning sessions that last many hours or even days. Suspects are kept awake through continuous interrogation, bright lighting, and denial of rest opportunities, creating cognitive impairment that makes them more likely to confess. This technique is particularly effective because sleep deprivation impairs memory formation, decision-making ability, and resistance to suggestion, making victims more compliant and less capable of maintaining consistent responses to questioning. The use of false evidence has become sophisticated and systematic in modern interrogation contexts. Police routinely lie to suspects about witness statements, physical evidence, surveillance footage, and forensic results, creating fabricated narratives that make guilt appear indisputable. These deceptions are legally permissible in most jurisdictions, giving interrogators powerful tools for psychological manipulation. Suspects faced with overwhelming fabricated evidence often conclude that confession is their only option, even when they know they are innocent. Psychological profiling and customized interrogation approaches have revolutionized modern confession extraction. Interrogators analyze suspects' personalities, backgrounds, and psychological vulnerabilities to develop targeted strategies for breaking resistance. Vulnerable populations, including juveniles, individuals with mental disabilities, and people suffering from mental illness, are subjected to specialized techniques that exploit their particular susceptibilities. These approaches often produce confessions from people who lack the cognitive capacity to understand the consequences of their admissions. The documentation and recording of modern interrogations creates an illusion of transparency while actually facilitating abuse. Video recordings typically show only the suspect, not the interrogators, creating footage that appears to show voluntary confessions without revealing the coercive techniques being employed. Audio quality is often poor enough to obscure the specific methods being used while preserving the final confession. These recordings are then presented in court as evidence of guilt, despite being products of systematic psychological manipulation. Technology has amplified the effectiveness of modern interrogation techniques while making them harder to detect and prosecute. Computer databases allow interrogators to access detailed information about suspects' personal lives, relationships, and vulnerabilities before questioning begins. Social media analysis provides insights into personality traits and psychological pressure points that can be exploited during interrogation. Artificial intelligence systems are being developed to analyze speech patterns, body language, and physiological responses to optimize interrogation strategies in real time. The phenomenon of false confessions has reached epidemic proportions in modern justice systems, with documented cases numbering in the thousands and suspected cases numbering far higher. The Innocence Project has documented over 375 DNA exonerations in the United States, with approximately 25% involving false confessions. These cases represent only the tip of the iceberg, as most false confessions occur in cases where DNA evidence is not available to prove innocence. The actual number of innocent people imprisoned based on coerced confessions likely numbers in the tens of thousands. Vulnerable populations are disproportionately affected by modern interrogation techniques, with juveniles, individuals with mental disabilities, and people suffering from mental illness being particularly susceptible to producing false confessions. The case of Brendan Dassey, whose confession as a 16-year-old with intellectual disabilities was obtained through manipulative interrogation techniques, illustrates how modern methods can destroy innocent lives while appearing legally proper. Dassey's confession was recorded, appeared voluntary to casual observers, and was used to convict him of murder despite overwhelming evidence of his innocence and mental incapacity. The international scope of modern false confession techniques demonstrates how these methods have spread beyond their American origins. Countries around the world have adopted variations of the Reed technique and similar approaches, often with even fewer legal protections for suspects. The result has been a global epidemic of false confessions that undermines justice systems worldwide while maintaining the appearance of legitimate law enforcement activity. Perhaps most disturbing is how modern interrogation techniques have been normalized and accepted by societies that consider themselves enlightened and humanitarian. Police officers are trained in these methods as standard procedure. Prosecutors rely on confessions obtained through psychological manipulation, and courts accept coerced admissions as evidence of guilt. The entire system has become dependent on techniques that produce false confessions while maintaining plausible deniability about their coercive nature. The sanitization of torture through modern interrogation techniques represents a fundamental corruption of justice that is more dangerous than historical brutality precisely because it is less visible and more broadly accepted. By wrapping psychological torture in legal procedures and professional terminology, modern societies have created systems that destroy innocent lives while convincing themselves they are upholding the rule of law. Think modern police interrogation is just good detective work. These scientific techniques destroy more innocent lives than medieval torture ever did. They're just better at hiding it. Smash that like button if you're starting to question everything you thought you knew about criminal justice, and tell us in the comments, have you ever wondered how many innocent people are sitting in prison right now because of forced confessions? Subscribe and ring that notification bell, because this rabbit hole of injustice goes even deeper than you imagine. The innocent condemned when the system destroys those it claims to protect. Eddie Joe Lloyd sat in his cell at Jackson State Prison, slowly dying from the medications that had been prescribed to treat his mental illness. When DNA evidence finally proved what he had tried to tell authorities for 17 years, he was innocent of the rape and murder that had sent him to prison for life. It was 2002, and Eddie had become the 110th person exonerated through DNA testing in the United States. But what made his case particularly horrifying wasn't just the wrongful conviction, it was how police had extracted his detailed confession while he was sedated in a psychiatric hospital, exploiting his mental illness and medication-induced confusion to manufacture evidence against him in a crime he couldn't possibly have committed. The stories of the innocent condemned reveal the true cost of our obsession with confession-based justice, demonstrating how the techniques perfected over centuries of torture and psychological manipulation continue to destroy lives in modern democratic societies. These cases aren't aberrations or mistakes. They are the predictable results of systems designed to extract confessions regardless of guilt or innocence, systems that have learned to hide their brutality behind legal procedures and professional terminology. The Central Park 5 case epitomizes how modern interrogation techniques can destroy multiple innocent lives simultaneously while creating compelling narratives of guilt that fool entire societies. In 1989, 5 teenagers, Antron McCrae, Kevin Richardson, Yusef Salam, Raymond Santana, and Corey Wise, were subjected to hours of aggressive interrogation without adequate legal representation after being arrested in connection with the brutal rape of a jogger in Central Park. The interrogation techniques used included isolation from families, denial of food and water, repeated assertions of guilt, presentation of false evidence, and psychological manipulation specifically designed to break down juvenile resistance. The confessions extracted from these teenagers were detailed, emotionally convincing, and completely false. Each boy was told that his friends had already confessed and implicated him, creating psychological pressure to provide matching admissions. They were promised leniency in exchange for cooperation, threatened with harsh punishment if they continued to deny involvement. and subjected to the kind of psychological warfare that would have been familiar to Soviet interrogators. The videotaped confessions were later used to convict all five, despite the absence of physical evidence linking them to the crime. What makes the Central Park case particularly significant is how it revealed the racial dynamics of forced confession in America. All five defendants were Black or Latino teenagers from poor families, lacking the resources to mount effective legal defenses against the coercive techniques employed by experienced interrogators. Their confessions were readily accepted by prosecutors, judges, and juries who had been conditioned to believe that detailed admissions must reflect genuine guilt, especially when they came from marginalized defendants whom society was predisposed to view as criminals. The Norfolk 4 case demonstrates how false confessions can create cascading wrongful convictions that destroy entire communities. In 2005, 8 U.S. Navy sailors were charged with the rape and murder of Michelle Moore Bosco in Norfolk, Virginia, based entirely on confessions extracted through coercive interrogation techniques. Detective Robert Glenn Ford employed the Reed technique and related methods to extract detailed admissions from men who had no involvement in the crime, using each confession to pressure others into providing corroborating statements. The interrogation techniques employed in the Norfolk case included sleep deprivation, isolation, repeated assertions of guilt, presentation of fabricated evidence, and promises of leniency that were never intended to be honored. Suspects were told that failing to confess would result in the death penalty, while cooperation would lead to reduced charges. They were shown crime scene photographs and given details about the murder that they then incorporated into their confessions, creating the false impression that their knowledge of these details proved their involvement. The case of Brendan Dassey, documented in the Netflix series Making a Murderer, illustrates how interrogation techniques can be particularly devastating when applied to vulnerable populations. Dassey, a 16-year-old with intellectual disabilities, was subjected to interrogation techniques specifically designed to exploit his cognitive limitations and suggestibility. Investigators used leading questions, false promises, and psychological manipulation to extract a detailed confession to murder and sexual assault that contradicted physical evidence and his own previous statements. The interrogation of Dassey was recorded, providing a disturbing window into how modern confession extraction techniques operate in practice. Investigators repeatedly fed him information about the crime, suggested specific scenarios for him to confirm, and used his desire to please authority figures to manipulate him into providing the admissions they wanted. When Dassey's responses didn't match their preferred narrative, they guided him toward different answers until his statements aligned with their theory of the case. International cases demonstrate that false confessions are not uniquely American problems, but global phenomena that result from the widespread adoption of coercive interrogation techniques. The Guildford 4 and Birmingham 6 cases in the United Kingdom involved extensive torture of Irish suspects who were forced to confess to IRA bombings they didn't commit. The interrogation techniques included physical abuse, sleep deprivation, psychological torture, and threats against family members, demonstrating how quickly civilized societies can revert to brutality when dealing with suspected enemies. The psychological profiles of false confession victims reveal disturbing patterns about who is most vulnerable to coercive interrogation techniques. Juveniles, individuals with mental illness, people with intellectual disabilities, and those suffering from substance abuse or withdrawal are all disproportionately represented among false confession cases. These populations lack the cognitive resources to resist sophisticated psychological manipulation, making them easy targets for interrogators seeking quick confessions to close difficult cases. The aftermath of wrongful convictions based on false confessions demonstrates the lasting damage these cases inflict on individuals, families, and communities. Exonerees often struggle with psychological trauma, difficulty reintegrating into society, and ongoing suspicion from people who continue to believe they are guilty despite DNA evidence proving their innocence. Families are destroyed, communities are torn apart, and faith in justice systems is permanently damaged by revelations that innocent people have been imprisoned for crimes they didn't commit. Perhaps most disturbing is how false confession cases reveal the institutional resistance to acknowledging wrongful convictions even when evidence of innocence becomes overwhelming. Prosecutors fight DNA testing, judges resist overturning convictions, and police departments refuse to investigate how their interrogation techniques produced false confessions. The system's investment in maintaining the appearance of infallibility often proves stronger than its commitment to correcting injustices, leading to prolonged imprisonment of people whose innocence has been clearly established. The economic costs of false confessions extend far beyond the obvious expenses of wrongful imprisonment and eventual compensation. The real perpetrators of crimes remain free, while innocent people serve their sentences, often committing additional crimes that could have been prevented. The legal costs of eventual exonerations, the settlements paid to wrongfully convicted individuals, and the damage to public confidence in justice systems all represent massive societal expenses that result from our continued reliance on confession-based prosecutions. The international scope of false confession problems demonstrates how interrogation techniques developed in one context can spread globally, carrying their potential for abuse to new jurisdictions with different legal protections and cultural norms. American-style interrogation methods have been adopted by police forces worldwide, often with even fewer safeguards against abuse, creating a global epidemic of wrongful convictions based on coerced admissions. The stories of the innocent condemned serve as powerful reminders that the techniques we've inherited from centuries of torture and psychological manipulation continue to operate in modern democratic societies, destroying lives while maintaining the appearance of legitimate law enforcement. These cases aren't historical curiosities, but ongoing tragedies that reveal the true cost of our failure to learn from the dark chapters of human history. Still think false confessions are rare exceptions. Thousands of innocent people are rotting in prison right now because of the same torture techniques we've been discussing, just dressed up in modern legal language. Hit that like button if these stories are making you question everything about our justice system, and comment below. Do you think you could resist these interrogation techniques if you were innocent but under extreme pressure? Subscribe now, because the final chapter will show you how this ancient cycle of injustice continues to evolve and spread in ways that will shock you. The Digital Inquisition. How technology perfected the art of manufacturing truth. In a windowless server room in Beijing, artificial intelligence algorithms process millions of conversations, social media posts, and digital interactions every second, identifying patterns of dissent and flagging individuals for voluntary confession sessions. It's 2024, and the Chinese social credit system has evolved beyond simple surveillance into a sophisticated mechanism for encouraging self-incrimination and preemptive confession. Citizens now confess to thought crimes before they're even accused, report on their neighbors' suspicious behaviors, and participate willingly in their own digital interrogation because the algorithms have made resistance futile and confession profitable. The digital age has transformed forced confession from a physical process conducted in isolated chambers into an omnipresent system that operates continuously in the background of daily life. Modern technology hasn't eliminated the ancient practice of extracting admissions through coercion. It has perfected it, making it invisible, automated, and seemingly voluntary, while achieving levels of effectiveness that medieval torturers could never have imagined. Artificial intelligence systems now analyze speech patterns, micro-expressions, and physiological responses to predict which interrogation techniques will be most effective against specific individuals. Machine learning algorithms process thousands of previous interrogations to identify the psychological pressure points most likely to produce confessions, creating customized approaches that exploit individual vulnerabilities with surgical precision. The result is interrogation technology that can break resistance faster and more reliably than any human interrogator, while maintaining detailed records of every technique employed and every response generated. Digital surveillance has created unprecedented opportunities for gathering information that can be used to pressure confessions from suspected criminals. Cell phone location data, internet browsing histories, social media interactions, financial transactions, and communication records all provide detailed portraits of individuals' lives that can be weaponized during interrogation. Suspects are confronted with comprehensive documentation of their activities, relationships, and private thoughts, creating psychological pressure that makes denial seem impossible and confession appear to be the only rational response. The integration of biometric monitoring into interrogation processes has enabled real-time optimization of psychological pressure techniques. Heart rate monitors, skin conductance sensors, and eye tracking systems provide continuous feedback about suspects' stress levels and emotional responses, allowing interrogators to adjust their approaches dynamically for maximum effectiveness. These systems can detect when resistance is weakening, when particular topics are causing distress, and when suspects are becoming most susceptible to confession, turning interrogation into a precision instrument guided by objective physiological data. Social media analysis has revolutionized the preparation phase of modern interrogations, providing detailed psychological profiles that inform customized confession extraction strategies. AI systems analyze years of posts, comments, likes, and interactions to identify personality traits, emotional triggers, relationship dynamics, and psychological vulnerabilities that can be exploited during questioning. Suspects arrive at interrogation rooms to find that their interrogators know intimate details about their fears, desires, relationships, and psychological weaknesses, creating immediate power imbalances that facilitate confession extraction. The phenomenon of digital self-incrimination has created new categories of voluntary confession that operate outside traditional interrogation contexts. Social media posts, online searches, location data, and digital communications are increasingly used as evidence of criminal intent or guilt, encouraging individuals to confess to crimes they might not have been suspected of committing. The permanence and searchability of digital communications have created environments where people effectively interrogate themselves, providing prosecutors with confession-like evidence without the need for formal questioning. Predictive policing algorithms now identify individuals likely to commit crimes before offenses occur, creating opportunities for preemptive interrogation and confession extraction. These systems analyze patterns of behavior, association, and location to flag potential criminals, who are then subjected to enhanced surveillance and eventual questioning about crimes they haven't yet committed. The psychological pressure of being identified as a future criminal often produces confessions to past offenses, creating a feedback loop where algorithmic predictions become self-fulfilling prophecies. The gamification of confession through digital platforms has made self-incrimination seem voluntary and even rewarding. Apps that encourage users to confess to minor infractions in exchange for social recognition, rehabilitation programs that reward detailed admissions of guilt, and social credit systems that provide benefits for self-reporting violations all create environments where confession becomes habitual and normalized. These systems exploit human psychology to make admission of guilt seem like positive behavior rather than potentially self-destructive testimony. Deepfake technology and AI-generated evidence have created new possibilities for manufacturing confessions through fabricated documentation. Suspects can be shown video footage of themselves committing crimes they never committed, audio recordings of conversations that never occurred, and digital communications they never sent, creating overwhelming fabricated evidence that makes confession seem like the only logical response. The sophistication of these fabrications often makes them indistinguishable from authentic evidence, even to experts, creating powerful tools for psychological manipulation. The automation of interrogation processes through chatbots and AI systems has enabled continuous questioning that never stops, never gets tired, and never makes mistakes in applying psychological pressure. Digital interrogators can maintain conversations with suspects for days or weeks, applying consistent pressure while monitoring responses for signs of weakening resistance. These systems learn from each interaction, becoming more effective at extracting confessions while providing plausible deniability about their coercive nature. International data sharing agreements have created global surveillance networks that enable cross-border confession extraction and evidence manufacturing. Information gathered in one country can be used to pressure confessions in another, creating jurisdictional confusion that makes it difficult for suspects to understand their rights or obtain effective legal representation. The global nature of digital surveillance has effectively eliminated the concept of sanctuary, making it impossible for individuals to escape the reach of confession extraction systems. The integration of confession technology into everyday devices has made interrogation omnipresent and invisible. Smart home devices, fitness trackers, smartphones, and other connected technologies continuously gather data that can be used to identify criminal activity and pressure admissions of guilt. The voluntary adoption of these technologies by consumers has created comprehensive surveillance networks that operate with consent, making traditional interrogation rooms obsolete when entire lives can be monitored and analyzed for signs of criminal behavior. Perhaps most disturbing is how digital confession systems have learned to exploit human psychology to make coercion feel like cooperation. Through careful manipulation of rewards and punishments, these systems train individuals to confess voluntarily to maintain access to digital services, social connections, and economic opportunities. The result is a society where confession becomes a survival strategy rather than an admission of actual guilt, creating populations that police themselves more effectively than any external authority could manage. The global expansion of digital confession technology represents the ultimate evolution of techniques that began with ancient torture chambers and medieval inquisitions. By combining surveillance capabilities that exceed the wildest dreams of historical interrogators with psychological manipulation techniques refined over centuries of practice, modern systems have created the perfect mechanism for extracting confessions while maintaining the appearance of voluntary cooperation and legitimate law enforcement. The future promises even more sophisticated integration of confession extraction into the fabric of daily life, with neural interfaces, quantum computing, and advanced AI systems, potentially enabling direct access to human thoughts and memories. The ancient goal of forcing truth from reluctant minds may finally be achieved through technology that makes resistance not just futile, but literally impossible, completing a journey that began when the first authority decided that confession was more important than truth. Welcome to the digital panopticon, where every click, every search, every message becomes potential evidence against you, and the most effective interrogators are algorithms that never sleep, never forget, and never show mercy. If this final chapter has opened your eyes to how completely we're all under surveillance and digital interrogation, smash that like button and share this video with everyone who still thinks they have nothing to hide. Comment below, what digital confession have you already made without realizing it? Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because understanding how we got here is the only way to avoid the dystopian future we're heading toward. The techniques that condemned the innocent throughout history haven't disappeared, they've just gone digital, and we're all potential victims now.